And we are live. Welcome, everybody. For those of you that are live, welcome to another live networking event here on the 17thfloor.com. For those of you that are watching this, I guess as a rerun or listening to it on a podcast, welcome to you as well. Just as a quick reminder for all of you for the first that are here for the first time, the 17th Floor is an online community that is focused on the growing practice of human capital management, which gathers HR, accounting, and payroll professionals together for peer-to-peer engagement, education, and mentorship. Every couple of weeks, we host one of these live networking chats featuring special industry guests along with our members here on the community and our board of advisors, where we chat about our own experiences in uplifting businesses by elevating the well-being of our employees. My name is Sam Fiorella. I'm one of the members here in the 17th Floor community, and I'll be acting as your moderator for today's chat. And today, I'm really excited about this one. Whether if I wasn't moderating, I would definitely be listening in because as an employer myself, I am really conflicted with the labor market that is going on today. We have a situation where there's a pending, we're coming out of COVID and what that's done to change the marketplace. Lots of people are looking for jobs, different types of jobs. And I know that people like myself who are looking to hire, we don't seem to be able to find enough people to fill those jobs. Yet there's lots of people looking for jobs. So it's really contradictory. And the whole idea of workforce development right now I think needs a shift and a better understanding. We really are in a time of flux. And I think that's why I'm so excited about today's presentation and in particular, our guest speakers. So first off, I'd like to introduce them. We're going to start with Jake Hirsch-Allen, who is the North American Workforce Development and Higher Ed System Lead at LinkedIn. And I have other stuff here to say about you, Jake, but quite frankly, I have no clue what that title is. So
the joke is I made it up. And the joke is the longer your title, the less important you are. So I just figured I'd throw as many different words into one title as possible to make sure that, this conversation happens every time.
Okay. So do you want to, because I tried. I mean, I asked the people at Google and nobody knows what it is. Can you explain what it is that you do?
Of course. The reason, in essence, I put together higher ed and workforce development systems into one title is because I wanted to call out the fact that I was the person, when you are thinking at a systems level in either higher education or helping unemployed people get jobs anywhere in North America, and you want to talk to somebody at LinkedIn, I'm the one to call. That's sort of the short answer. The longer answer is I do public-private partnerships. So I'm an overlay on our government and our nonprofit teams and our higher ed teams whenever they work with somebody, not to hire their own staff, but rather to work with the public to help, for instance, correct for labor market challenges like the ones we're going to talk about today.
Perfect. So you are, in fact, the right person to be speaking to when it comes to this topic.
One of several.
And to help me here in asking you those questions and trying to help those, not only me personally, but those of us listening, how to figure all of this out is Marna Lagerquist, who is a member of our board of advisors here on the 17th Floor and holds certifications in both payroll and human resource management. But by day, she is the operating talent acquisition and development manager at 4Refuel. So with 15 years of experience in the industry, she leads a recruitment team and specializes in developing new programs to support the employee experience, retention, as well as strategic hiring. So I think we're covered on both sides of that. So welcome, Marna, and welcome, Jake. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to both your perspectives on this subject. For those of you who are listening live, feel free to ask any questions or to comment at all during this live chat. Just comment in the comment box below. Our speakers and I will get the chance to see it. And if we can, we'll answer those questions throughout our chat. So why don't we just jump right into it? I think we really need to address the current labor market situation right now. So, Jake, I'm going to ask you first. Give us your take. What is the current labor market situation, and how has that really been changing in the last 6 months?
So I might ask for a little bit more specificity, only because one can talk about it sort of globally. one can talk about it in terms of North America, which is what I tend to focus on. And then, of course, I'm based in Canada. We're based in Canada. So I'm calling from Vancouver. I'm usually in Toronto, and the situation's actually just different between those two cities. But overall, to answer sort of at a super high level, when you said we're in a state of transition or flux, it's because the pandemic did change how people think about work at the sort of white collar computer worker level in such a significant way that it actually had ripple effects, I think, throughout the economy. And the contrast between the changes that were happening for those of us, for instance, who were able to work at home through a pandemic, and you contrast that with those who, for instance, were essential workers having to go into situations at risk throughout a pandemic, and in many cases be turned off of jobs or sort of be woken up to the possibility of better jobs as a result of the danger that they were put in. And that contrast means that we're now in a different labor market than we were 2-3 years ago and or ever in history. And the specific example that I think you mentioned at the most macro level is we have both more people looking for employees, we have more employers struggling to find the right people for jobs, and more people interested in changing jobs at the same time as what looks like a pending recession and a full labor market. So each of those two scenarios, right? Employers not being able to find workers and workers looking for jobs, and a labor market that looks like it's as tight as it's ever been almost in history, while the economy is dipping. Those two scenarios have never occurred before. And what that means on the ground is, I think, what we'll probably spend the rest of our time together discussing. But I think as a frame, those contradictions are puzzling, to say the least.
Yeah, Martin, I'd like to get your take if you're seeing that live. But can we maybe just? I want to interject here, because I think a lot of people are still confused over this concept of, if there's a lot of people looking for jobs, but employers can't seem to be finding anybody to fill those jobs. How is it the pandemic that why is there? Where is the disconnect?
Yeah, so I think in some ways there always has been a disconnect, because we have an imperfect labor market, right? It's made up of human beings who aren't in exactly the right job for each person, and we don't have exactly the right number of people in each industry or each company, et cetera. So it's always going to be a somewhat imperfect labor market. But what we called, a skills gap right before the pandemic, and right now folks are often calling a mismatch at scale, those are aggravated. Those have been aggravated by a period in which more people, in the States, there was very much a great resignation, less so in Canada, but let's say like the she-session in Canada, where a ton of women left the labor market and then came back in, that resulted in changes at a rate and at a scale that we haven't seen before. And what I'm really excited about having Marna on this call is, in my opinion, to sort of jump ahead a little bit, the solution to a lot of these problems is for us to think the way Marna does, to think about in higher education, in particularly workforce development, and how we get unemployed people jobs. Let's start thinking about things from the perspective of HR and recruiting and talent pipelines, instead of thinking about these industries as completely separate, where you get your education in one place and then you get your job another place, and there's this big gap in between.
Marna, have you seen that? Has that been your experience in your talent acquisition?
So what I find is, yes, there is, as he said, there's lots of opportunities, but people not being able to fill them, but they don't necessarily have the qualities that they need to fill them. And that's kind of where we're seeing a bit of the challenge. Like, yes, there's lots of opportunities, and yes, there is other people in the market, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have the skills to fill those skilled positions. And that's kind of where you're seeing a little bit of a struggle. So I may have, position, like, for example, a majority of the roles that we do are in the trucking industry. So someone that maybe wants to change careers can't just jump into a truck right away after completing school. They need a certain amount of experience due to the type of role that we do, and it being safety sensitive. So someone changing their career, as I said, we need a year experience before that we can have them jump in and do that position. So you're seeing a little bit of unbalance there. So that's definitely one of the things that I'm seeing. And if it's a different kind of position, more an office space, we've been able to open our area a little bit more as well. Having the opportunity to work remotely opens our talent pool as well. And we're also open to, you know, somebody not necessarily having every single skill. And I mean, I know each organization's a little bit different, but when you see a job description, you look at it, you know, that's the hiring manager's wish list. But, you know, we are able to take, you know, there's a couple of things that we can go in, we can train and show them how to do it rather than just a straight no. So kind of working with the talent market right now and adjusting to it as we go. So there's no definite answer. It's just as you go, figuring it out.
I mean, I love that sort of ability to both innovate and be agile, to sort of change things on the go. And I also love, Marna, how you described the job description as a wish list, because so many folks have viewed it as set in stone, as sort of a limiting factor that has in many ways discriminated against, for instance, people who don't have X years of experience or Y degrees, which very much tend to be dominated by those, not, I'll use the lefty term as privilege, but those who have had access to a full 4-year degree obviously have, to some extent, greater access to opportunity. And in many cases, if an employer actually just needs X or Y skill, they can be looking to folks who didn't get that 4-year degree or don't have those 2 years of experience, but rather are able to demonstrate that skill in some other way. And I think Marna nailed the way that is most popular to demonstrate those skills, which is sort of work integrated learning in the broadest sense, from internships to apprenticeships to any form of on-the-job experience. The last thing I wanted to say is I noticed that Louis Philippe in the chat has mentioned, you know, how the Great Resignation was much more an American phenomenon than a Canadian, and also that, for instance, you know, the trucking industry was both hit hard and has, of course, received a lot of political attention. But I think that the first question he raised with regard specifically to the difference between the Canadian and the US labor markets is an important one for this conversation. We are not in the same situation as America in Canada, because in the States in particular, as an example, you have huge percentages of those who just have no post-secondary education whatsoever, right? If 80% of Canadians have some form of certificate or degree, I think it's closer to 50 or 60 in America. And there's a much, much larger percentage of people who don't have a social support network. They don't have the healthcare, the housing, the other things that government, to a greater extent, not a perfect extent, but to a much greater extent, supplies in Canada. And the result is that you actually never really had that massive gap that existed in the US, where all of these people dropped out of the labor market and then sort of really quickly popped back in. In Canada, instead, much more like in Europe, there was a little dip, and then sort of the government corrected for it relatively quickly in a variety of ways.
Do you guys find then that in terms of having to make that shift, right? I like what Marna was talking about, that it's not necessarily as an organization, like with human capital management, and we, as I introduced, you know, what we do here at the 17th floor in terms of peer-to-peer mentorship, I want to focus a little bit on how do we help people kind of bridge this gap and get employees into the company. So what I'm hearing you guys say, and please riff on this if I'm completely wrong, or tell me how smart I am and that I got it perfect, is that we may not have the perfect labor force out there in terms of trained skills for what we need because of all of the shifts that are happening. And there's other issues of, you know, like the move from manufacturing to tech, you know, move from fossil fuel to renewable energy, like all of these things that are happening right now in our economy, aside from just the pandemic. Do professionals in HR, payroll, do we need to start focusing on creating this online or this educational institutions within our own organizations to be bringing people with the core skills, or at least, you know, the minimum level of skills, and then focus on developing them into who we need a year from now, as opposed to bringing in people that are exactly what we need from day one?
The short answer is absolutely. Not only will we never find the perfect person from day one with all the skills for a given job, but more importantly, we are amongst the worst developed countries in the world in Canada at training on the job. We have not been able to figure out, as employers or as government, as nonprofits or as higher education institutions, how to get folks to continue learning before that batch loaded, you know, 4-year degree at the beginning or 2-year certificate at the beginning of their career. And it's really, it's one of sort of the most obvious causes for Canada's productivity gap, the reason why in many ways we are less productive than other developed countries. We just stop learning after post-secondary. And I think a lot of the blame, to be really blunt, is on employers for sort of not picking up that mantle and not picking up that responsibility, because it is a burden, right? It's not easy learning pedagogy, learning how to teach, encouraging employees, in addition to their day jobs, which obviously deliver on sort of capital investments in a more direct manner, to be thinking a little bit long term about their careers. The opposite, though, I think is really true as well. If companies invest in their employees, specifically through education, they will retain those employees longer, those employees will be happier, and the companies in the long term will be more productive.
Marna, I think I know that's part of what you do in terms of the innovation that you are spearheading within your organization. It isn't just about the talent acquisition, but on the retention and training programs. What efforts do you guys put into having a permanent training or educational system in your company?
Well, I think it starts.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, sorry, when you're answering that question, who in the organization owns that? You know, Jake said that it's, you know, companies need to take this responsibilities, but ultimately inside there needs to be a cheerleader. There needs to be somebody who spearheads that.
Well, I think first of all, everybody owns it, but different people are directed to do different portions of it. So within my role, half of it is involved in the talent acquisition and half is doing on the program development. It starts right from onboarding, right from recruitment to onboarding. Like one of the programs I developed was onboarding. And, you know, as I mentioned, a lot of our individuals are drivers, so their career progression may be a little different than the individuals in the office. So it's really recognizing the different positions right from onboarding them and developing programs, growth programs, leadership programs. We have all kinds of different programs that we do to encourage individuals to stay. We're very big on employee engagement. I know even when I'm recruiting, a lot of people, what's your culture like? What's the work environment? You know, people work for people, and you want to make sure fit is another important thing, even from a recruitment perspective, even from onboarding, all of it. You want to make sure, okay, they have a certain amount of skills, but they need to have the right fit. But putting them, you know, learning a lot about who they are, having that employee experience, knowing that their employer cares about them and wants to be there to support them makes all the difference. Like employee engagement is our biggest value. Without people, they're our biggest assets, and you need to invest in them, and that's something our company has really recognized. Oh, I can't hear you, Sam.
Maybe I think we need to have that. You're on mute, you idiot. For these things. So do either of you guys have any experience around budgeting for these types of things? Because my experience in the corporate world, I've been in management almost my entire career. And the one thing that I've seen very rarely when I'm looking at corporate budgets is a employee training program and how much you should be allocating. You know, we know how much of a percentage of your earnings should be dedicated to rent or dedicated to your employee, your workforce in total, or, you know, to marketing. But I've rarely seen any kind of a line item when it comes to employee training.
We invest heavily in that. That's what I can comment on that. Obviously, I can't give you numbers or anything, but we do heavily invest in training. It's very important, even for myself, you know?
Yeah, I also don't have a number, and I wish I did, because I think actually, Sam, that would be a helpful indicator. You know, probably depends on business size. Massive multinational probably needs to spend a different percentage of its income or revenue or capital on human resources and on L&D in particular. I noticed again that Louis Philippe in the chat was mentioning the Quebec 1% law. A bunch of European countries have similar laws where basically companies are reimbursed for 1% of the expenses that they have focused on L&D and training their employees, which I think is a fantastic program. The feds in Canada rolled out a somewhat similar program, although it hasn't had as much uptake, in part because of the limitations on it. It requires that you first pay for the training and then get the tax back, which is, I think, one of the challenges folks are facing, and it's probably a little too complicated to apply for many to achieve the uptake that the federal government originally intended. But irrespective those specific government programs, I think if companies themselves simply think about what is the increase in productivity? What is the increase in retention and in employee happiness and engagement, as Marna was referencing, that they're going to get from this L&D, that hitting the 5 or 10% mark actually isn't as crazy as that number might seem otherwise, because they're going to get way more effective workforces. And again, to Marna's point, talent is by far their most valuable resource, even at a resource intensive company like so many in Canada are.
Is there what's the difference? I know you were mentioning in Quebec and at the beginning that you're in Vancouver, and that while there's a difference between Canada and the US, there's, like everything else in this country, there's a big difference between East, Central, and Western Canada. Jake, have you noticed there being like a big discrepancy between job needs and the needs of employees and the talent that's looking for jobs across the country? Is there anything that you can say is common?
That's interesting. So there are definitely some trends. And the trends, I think, are regional, as you're pointing out. As an example, Alberta's reliance on the oil and gas industry has really resulted in fluctuations in its economy that dominate much more so than, I'm in tech. And so I founded a company called Lighthouse Labs, a boot camp that runs across Canada, and that has a particularly large presence in Calgary. And so we are among the many. I'm also on the board of something called the Information Communications Technology Council that does a bunch of reports on the tech industry, and both keep talking about how Calgary is the fastest growing tech center in the world. Toronto has more tech workers per capita than any others, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge with some of these stats, though, is it doesn't put into perspective the fact that Calgary's economy is really fluctuating based on the price of oil, not based on the number of tech workers coming and going. And frankly speaking, Canada's economy is still primarily resource-based. So I think what we have to do when we take into consideration a lot of the hoopla around sexy industries like tech, or even to some extent education, whether we're talking about the sort of breakthroughs in bioscience or otherwise, is the fact that Canada remains a largely resource dependent mining, oil and gas. Out here in BC, it's wood, right? The lumber industry is massive out here. And so when you take a look at what percent of our total economy, what percent of our banks' investments are in those industries, it's so significant that really remains the bellwether, despite some of those regional differences, Calgary being way more dependent on it, or the East Coast, which has had less resources of late and less economic growth of late, really having a surplus of labor and really having sort of the highest unemployment rates in the country.
Yeah, and that leads to a lot of employee migration or workforce migration. I know that there's a lot of East Coasters that were traveling out to Alberta just because of the oil boom that was happening there years ago, and that stopped when there was all that offshore oil was being developed, and taken advantage of in the East, which has slowed down again. So we're starting to see that migration happening again across the country.
One other aspect of migration, migration is probably, I should have mentioned it is the single greatest source, of course, of new labor for Canada. And really our economy, I think, is more dependent in a positive way on migration than on any other aspect of labor markets, perhaps even more so than education, because as an example, a lot of our educational institutions at this point are approaching the 50% mark for international students, which would suggest, how important those international forces are just on the education industry. But if you look outside of that industry, they're, I think, even more important, because when you look at migrant labor, it is filling in a lot of the gaps that the choices that Canadian citizens are making not to go into certain fields are leaving. So you have that Great Resignation in America wasn't particularly problematic because they couldn't fill in a lot of those gaps with immigrant labor, legal or otherwise. In Canada, we often do fill those gaps with legal, temporary, or permanent migrants, newcomers. And the challenge is we don't necessarily support them well enough, and we haven't quite figured out how to ensure that those individuals are welcomed into our society the same way that we do such an amazing job of settling refugees and others.
So Lisa, I want to switch gears here a little bit. Lisa, who's listening to us live right now, just asked a question or made a comment that a lot of times we see when the budget cuts are being made, training and education are the first to go or to be downside. I run a marketing company, so I can tell you that I would argue that marketing is always the first budget to be decreased, when things get bad. But this is really interesting. We've been talking about how much of a budget, or at least a focus, organizations should be putting into corporate training or employee training to try and bridge this gap that we've identified at the start of this conversation. And ideally, maybe who should even be leading that charge within the organization. Are you guys seeing that? Lisa, I'm going to start with you on this one. Do you notice that with the programs that you're creating, or the amount that you're able to invest, that is fluctuating based on, or the importance of that changes based on how the business is doing in general?
Martin, I think that one's for you.
Or Marna, for you? Would you? Yeah, I thought maybe for
Sorry, you said Lisa, so I apologize.
No, Lisa posted the question. It was my mistake. Sorry.
So sorry, can you rephrase it then? I apologize.
Yeah, no, not a problem. But just Lisa was talking about how, or you can see there on the bottom
Yes.
of the screen, that a lot of times budgets are cut when it comes to training, when the economy is bad, or when a business isn't doing particularly well, they have a down quarter. Have you been noticing that the budgets that you have available to you, whether at your organization or within your industry, do also fluctuate with that economy, or does it remain a priority?
It remains a priority. And I can't answer on a lot of other companies, but you hope that it would be. But I think Lisa made a good point, not necessarily with mine, but with other companies. I have seen that happen throughout my career. But
so Jake, I suspect that that's probably not universal, correct?
Agreed. And in fact, one of the challenges, I think what Lisa pointed out is certainly felt throughout the HR community and the L&D community. And I'm curious, actually, Sam, when you said, you're in marketing, so you feel like marketing budgets are always cut first. I'm only surprised at that because I've spent much of the past 7 to 8 years within the sales, not department, but unit within LinkedIn, right? We have 8,000 of our 18,000 employees, massive ballpark numbers there. Apologies if they're wrong, who focus on sales or marketing. And I expect it's in the hundreds who focus on L&D internally. And we're a company that does L&D for other companies. Obviously, we sell LinkedIn Learning, etc. And so I think with that in mind, it is often, particularly in North America, HR and specifically L&D that is cut first, and that is highly, highly problematic. And so part of what I sort of would want to do with a call like this is arm folks in HR, in L&D, in human capital management with the arguments that they can then take to the C-suite who are going to make these decisions. Because practically speaking, as Marna's pointed out, you want leadership. You want the CEO and the CHRO you want ideally a chief learning officer, even in a small company, to be thinking about what the long-term implications of not providing their employees with enough training, education in the flow of work. Like, we're not just talking about sending folks to in-person seminars, right? Like, it's thankfully education has evolved a ton, and particularly over the pandemic, to the point where we can actually, to the point of LinkedIn Learning or Coursera, insert it in the flow of work, but then also can sort of go back and forth between a variety of hybrid forms of learning, wherein somebody from a given company is engaging people with real-time live content, either online or in person, and then swapping in high-quality Hollywood third-party content where it does a better job of communicating the message. And primarily what I'm talking about is video, but that's true across audio, from podcasts to other forms of training, to text, to interactive, gaming, etc. And what I'm blown away by is how slow companies, even sort of the world more generally, has been to adapt to those kinds of learning. And I think what it indicates is, even if we know that they're better for learning, people take a while to change. And so maybe one last thing to add to this rant is an emphasis on change management and capacity building. It's not just that folks have to learn, it's also that they have to learn. And in doing so, that learning to learn process is actually often, I think, emotionally challenging, subconsciously and consciously. We have to start doing things in a different way. And so managing that change at an individual and an organizational level is something that organizations themselves have to invest in, as meta as that whole concept sounds.
kind of building on what Jake's saying, like adult learning is completely different when you're in university as a student, and it's really making sure organizations realize this. And even when I was doing some of my HR courses, some of the questions or some of the comments put in the information were, where does your company feel, or how does your company feel about training and development, and kind of teaching your company to learn that how important it is to invest in your people. So it's even touched the textbooks, you know, and it depends on the company. How do they feel about HR? How do they feel about the training? Where do they, it's not just an administration role. It adds a lot of value to the organization. And some companies have been quicker to realize that than others. So
I noticed Kathy and Louis Philippe were having a conversation about employees, sort of in the garage, but being Cadillacs that should be showcased. And I thought the conversation was particularly highlighted by examples during the pandemic of, for instance, an individual whose job at a restaurant normally was to host, right, to find a table for folks. But because folks weren't coming into the restaurant anymore, they started drawing the posters explaining where to pick up takeout food. And what the owners of the restaurant chain discovered was that this was actually a fantastic graphic designer who had been in a host role. And so they, of course, shifted them into corporate, into a graphic design role. That kind of transition has happened across many, many labor markets. The discovery that folks could be doing something that is closer to their passions or their skills, and which is more rewarding to the company. And so I think that nurturing employees as Cadillacs, as the most valuable thing within a company, but then also being able to isolate and help them learn about themselves in a way that isolates the skills that they have to contribute and match people to jobs based on those skills. I'm still convinced that's going to be both really positive for equality and for productivity. We're just a long way from sort of skills-based hiring and job matching and learning at a macro level.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier, Jake, about leaving people something, leaving those that are on the 17th floor community right now talking about this, giving them the tools to go back and then sell into their organization and promote within their organization, that we need to invest in better training. I think, one of the keys in doing that, and I think this is going to be a follow-up conversation, because I think we could do like a whole hour just on this. And so for my team listening on the background, start making notes, because we're going to start focusing on that. I think it makes a lot of sense to have, how do I sell this? Because, I know payroll is really driving the payroll of function, and in most organizations these days is really driving this, the idea of human capital management, and that we have to invest more into our employees, not just on what they do day to day, give them the right pencil, the right stapler, the right type of computer to be efficient, but give them the right encouragement and support on the job and outside the job, be it through training or others, to make our company better, and then to retain them for longer. So now that we've identified that there's this gap, what are some of the arguments that we want to give them? Like, why is it so important? How does it impact the bottom line? Jake, any research that you guys have done or your own personal experiences there on what those might be?
I mean, I was actually sort of looking for stats, which are never my forte. And I mentioned at the beginning that I'm got a bit of COVID brain going on right now. So my neurons aren't firing at quite the pace I'd like, particularly from a memory perspective. But I can point to sources. So if you look at the LinkedIn Learning blog, if you looked at Josh Burson and his writing, if you looked at Degreed or other, I think, front runners in online learning and what they're saying about why one should be investing specifically, and of course what they're selling, then I think you'll find a ton of fantastic statistics on the value of that learning for productivity, for efficiency, and for your bottom line, to be frank. I'll speak in generalities instead of statistics, and yet I think they're equally emotionally valuable. If you think of sort of what makes your company different from the next, it is almost never, as you said, the computer somebody's using or even the product they're producing. It's rather the entirety of that brand, which is defined by the people at the company. And that's why, for instance, I've been advising a firm that's focused on investing in good jobs for the past 2 to 3 years. And the reason they're investing in good jobs, the reason they're sort of doing the opposite of a lot of investment firms that tend to buy and then fire a bunch of people to make the company more profitable, is because they think they can actually achieve even more profitable companies by investing in the people, by doubling down on their L&D. And so if you're seeing the top investing firms in the world shift from a point where they were first thinking of humans as disposable and now thinking of them as the most important thing to invest in, I think they are perhaps, you know, the smartest money to follow in this respect. And as much as there's currently this whole hoopla around ESG, around environmental social governance standards, which is often how public companies are measured in terms of those standards, and yet where a lot of folks these days have been suggesting that those labels don't have a lot of depth or meaning. I think what's going to come out of that controversy is a renewed interest in the people behind the companies, as opposed to what the metrics are for how we evaluate their social impact. We can actually measure how long somebody stays at a company, how happy they are while at a company, to Marna's point about employee engagement, how productive they are, right? Whether they are, in essence, producing more per person of whatever widget or service that company is offering than before that L&D, that training, that employee investment was made. Those measurements are often a lot easier than the broad environmental, social, and even governance questions that are being called into question. And as a result, what people are going to double down in after this controversy is their employees. And hopefully the result will be much more productive and happy, equitable companies.
I also wanted to make a point. If you want to look at the bottom line, how much does turnover cost? That's a huge cost, training costs to get somebody back up to the level they need to be. But if you look at your turnover and actually evaluate the costs, and a lot of times when they're doing the costing on it, they don't think about, okay, the manager's time, the co-worker's time, all of these aren't considered into the actual P&L at the bottom line. So turnover is very expensive. So again, coming back to the training, investing in your people, you know, if you want to look at it from a monetary perspective, it's expensive to replace somebody.
And the list, interestingly, of reasons why investing in employees pays off, I've always found remarkably long. It isn't just, I mean, perhaps most importantly, Marna's point, that they stay longer, and because the cost is so great for turnover. I mean, I was talking to the head of workforce development at McDonald's, and I think they were saying that the turnover there is like over 50% per year. It's very, very high. I think it might be closer to 75% per year. So we're talking like a lot of these very large employers that hire primarily frontline workers, have massive turnover rates that are incredibly expensive. But then it's even more expensive for the sort of industries that require individuals with more training when they turn over. So retention, massive, but the list is really long. It's not just retention. It's also that the companies where employees are happier, where they're learning more, are the companies that are perceived better by the public. Their brand consistently, we ran a study across tens of thousands of companies on the association of purpose, wherein if the values of the individual at the company line up with the values of the company, then they will both stay there longer. People will perceive the company better. The company will sell more of its goods. It will be able to sell at higher prices. Like across almost every metric, companies do better when they invest in their people. And I think that is the takeaway point from this. Every study has shown it. I've actually I don't think I've ever seen a study that shows you can invest in your employees and the company will do worse in the long term. Certainly in the short term, some will leave. And that's the kind of risk that I've been so proud, for instance, of LinkedIn embracing in my time at LinkedIn, where a huge number of people have left and then what we call boomeranged. They've gone first onto their next play, which is what we call, going on to your next job, because we encourage folks to go on to their next play because it's a sign of growth and exploration. But then they boomerang right back to LinkedIn because we treat them so well here and we encourage that movement in and out of the company.
I think it's amazing. I love that. And it's, we hired a lot of students right out of university for a little while there, and we were noticing that personally ourselves, that, you expect that eventually their first job, they're going to get a sense of it. Oh, here's like 3 cents an hour more. I'm going to go here. Or, oh, they offer better lunches, or they have better coffee, so I'm going to go there. It's a more sexy job, whatever it happens to be. But then we always hear 6 months, a year down the line, yeah, but it's a sweatshop. Where I'm going, I much prefer the employee environment and training and support that you guys offered. So I think that's a very interesting point. I'm glad to see that we're not the only ones seeing that. The one thing though that I want to comment on is that a lot of companies that do take the time to focus on the value or the bottom line impact of training employees for the purposes of retention often don't see the value of creating those programs for acquisition of new employees, because it makes the acquisition of new employees so much better, because you end up not trying to find the needle in a haystack and the exhaustive search that takes, and then what you're going to have to pay that one person that has like every skill set, as opposed to identifying, what is the personality type that fits our organization. They may not have the skills, but it's okay, because when they come into the company, we have all the necessary training programs to get them to where they need to be, right? It just gives you a much bigger pool, to pull from when it comes to looking for the best employee that might actually stay longer with you, because all the things that we've talked about.
Fit is extremely important. Extremely. It's one of the most important things. Like you said, you can train people for certain things, but you can't change the person.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let's we're running out. We're not actually running out of time, because we don't have a specific time, but I think I got so many more questions that I feel that if I start to delve into any of these minutia anymore, we're going to be here for another hour. So maybe I can ask each one of you to look forward a little bit. We see that, what the trends kind of have been. Do we anticipate that these trends are going to continue? Or is there going to be something different coming up? Put on your I forget what they're called, at the oracles, where, but give us some thoughts about what you think is going to happen in terms of these trends in the future.
Marta, please.
Okay, well, I think the talent shortage isn't going to go away right away, and we definitely have to think about some different strategic advantages to what the market is. And I'd actually put kind of a little bit of a list together, but we're running out of time on that perspective.
Let's hear it.
All right, well, let me grab my paper here. Well, I mean, now I broke down a little bit more from the recruitment side, like simple things like the technology is changing. Things like, are you making sure your job descriptions are mobile friendly? Like this is I'm not sure if this is really where you were thinking, but what I'm getting at is we need to look on the recruitment side, what can we make? And as I said, I did put a few things together, and we kind of crossed one of them off, discussing with hiring managers if there's any flexibility in skill set, providing exceptional candidate experience. How many times have you gone through an interview process and you don't hear back, or nobody follows up, or it just gives you a bad taste in your mouth? Like, why would I want to work for that company? And then 2 weeks, maybe their first selection didn't work out. They call you 2 weeks later and say, hey, you're interested. Like, even if you don't select the individual, be, great. Like, give them that good experience. But I think we definitely need to look at processes, like especially simple things like job descriptions. Are they, too long, too short? It's just, I find a lot of times people look at that wish list and automatically eliminate themselves from it because they think, oh, okay. So sometimes going too in depth, they don't even read it. And my other kind of comment is the actual application process. I just find if it's too long or too tedious, they'll drop off in the middle. Not all of them, but some of them will. So sometimes having, that quick apply or different things. And I don't know if I really answered your question, but leading into the future, I think if we don't make some changes, we definitely have to look at recruiting from a different perspective, but we also need to look at getting our individuals' skills trained a lot more, like or one-on-one training and different things. We definitely have to develop our people from a skill perspective in order to continue on and fill those skill gaps.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a prediction of what's to happen, but I love the fact that it's a call to action of what you in practice have been seeing and what we need to do. I think that's very valuable. If we're going to address this gap, let's just look at our processes, not just our training. I think that's important.
100%. I think each of those, Marta, are essential. And I'll pick up your last one and if it's okay, convert it into a prediction to Sam's point. Because I do think if I could list 4 items, skills-based hiring is perhaps the most immediate learning and hiring change that folks within human capital management and HR can affect, and which leaders at the C-suite and employees below can support. But if I could list 4 trends that I think are all going to continue, that were certainly accelerated by the pandemic, and which are perhaps still not being sufficiently thought about by folks in human capital management, they would be skills-based hiring for sure, how people interact with computers and technology, because still we don't emphasize enough that if you can really combine those two, and I'll explain this in more depth with a story, the better the interaction between the human and the computer, the more effective both are, the technology and the employee. Obviously, the massive increase in remote work, I think we're just seeing the beginnings of how that's going to change labor markets. We're seeing how it's changing economies, because people are now working from much more rural places. The housing crisis in America is as desperate in Arizona and Florida as it is in the Northeast and California, or Cleveland even. And then also, maybe last but certainly not least, the just beginning, but in the future likely dramatically larger gap in employees in the environmental industries and in industries related to climate change. And so if I can really quickly run through those, again, by far the most important in my mind is this idea that we can be matching individuals to jobs much more effectively and to learning much more effectively if we think about what skills are necessary for a job rather than what degrees, how many years of experience, the usual sort of wish list that Marna started this conversation with, that is a job description. Let's instead make that job description something that accurately captures what is necessary for a job, and then maybe can even be broken up so that you do have contract workers doing different components of it, but then full-time employees doing the things that actually require a full-time employee at a company, et cetera, et cetera. And I think maybe that segues into the remote work conversation, because in the same way that learning used to be either online or offline, used to be either in person or online, now really is hybrid. And we know that's actually better for most people. I work way better in person. I learn way better in person. My brother learns way better on a computer. He would sit across the street from his hall at McGill while I was in the classroom, and he would be at a coffee shop watching the exact same thing on a computer, because that's just how he learned better. And so we have to take into consideration not just different ways of learning, but also different ways of working through technology. And if we do so, then our employees will perform better. They'll learn better and they'll perform better. And so again, that probably segues us right into that human computer piece that I was talking about. And my favorite story here has to do with Kasparov. If you all know the chess player, who I think is yet again famous because of his Ukraine-Russian politics. But I'm speaking specifically about how he was devastated when he lost to a computer, and has since become one of the greatest champions of human-computer interaction, because he realized that essential lesson, which is that if a computer works with a human, or vice versa, a human learns how, in this case, to work the chess machine, they'll beat any other pure chess machine, and vice versa. So I like that idea that throughout life, we can be training our employees to interact with technology in a more healthy manner and a more productive manner. And then finally, as I said, LinkedIn and almost every other labor market information source I've ever seen are predicting that skills in industries related to climate change and the environment are only going to be more and more and more in demand. There is a minimal gap now between what's needed and the folks who are filling those jobs, but we think the gap is just going to keep going up because we aren't training enough folks for those industries. So I'll leave it maybe with those 4 trends in terms of what's to come. But thanks for the question, Sam, and thanks for teeing it up so well, Marna.
Well, I actually wanted to make one other point, and it's kind of a little bit off about compensation. One of the other things, and I didn't know if it was going to come up in our question, but what I'm noticing, yes, everybody's fighting for that extra dollar, but now we have 5 generations in the workforce. We really need to consider that from a full compensation. Somebody maybe that's closer to retirement, maybe focusing on RSPs. Another generation may be focusing on tuition reimbursement. So I think, there's no one standard compensation benefit package for anybody. And that's something that employers need to look at too. So what else can we offer to bring in potential candidates? So just that's kind of an off the cuff thought. I wasn't sure if that was going to quite come up, but I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, so Marna, just to repeat what you said, 5 generations in one company's workforce, and you're not, a massive multi-100,000 multinational. but within your company, you've got.
No, I mean in general, the world. I didn't mean for my specific company. I just meant in the market, in the workforce, there are 5 generations. Sorry, let me clarify.
But still, it's a remarkable stat, because you don't think of, great grandparents working with their grandchildren in some ways, in the labor market.
Yeah, it's happening.
Well, thanks, guys. Marna, Jake, thank you so much for joining me today. One of the reasons I really enjoy moderating these chats here on the 17th floor is just because it always inspires me to want to learn more and to want to engage more on this subject. I think it's fascinating. I really appreciate both your points of view coming again from both sides of this, both from a research and a practical experience. So I've taken a gazillion notes here, and I think if you guys are open, I'd like to do a follow-up at some point just to break some of these down a little bit further.
Of course.
Absolutely. Thank you for
a reminder
having
to
us.
everybody. Thank you. It's a reminder to everybody else watching live. Thank you for those questions that have been coming through, as well as your time. If you're watching this either live or on repeat somewhere on the 17th floor or on our podcast, just a reminder that we do this every couple of weeks, and they are all recorded and available to our members on the 17th floor as a resource to listen to anytime. If you have any questions for our panelists or others here on the 17th floor, the beauty is that we are a peer-to-peer network. This is not a corporate site. This is basically built by and run for professionals in the HR, accounting, and payroll community. So please feel free to post any questions down below, engage each other, check out the forum here on the site if you want to have a little bit more in-depth conversations around any of these. So until next time, thank you, everybody. Have a
Bye-bye.
good day.
Thanks all.